On the morning of May 19, 1536, a Queen of England knelt in the straw on Tower Green, and a swordsman imported from France took her head off with a single stroke. Her husband called it mercy. And for nearly 500 years, people mostly believed him. Then a researcher opened a forgotten Tudor warrant book and found something far colder written inside. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. The playground rhyme makes it all sound almost tidy. What Henry VIII's 6 wives actually endured was far darker than anything taught in school. To understand how 6 women were fed, one by one, into the same machine, the story has to start with the machine's builder. Henry Tudor was crowned in 1509, 17 years old, athletic, educated, adored, the Golden Prince of Europe. But underneath the glamour sat a single gnawing obsession that would define his reign and consume nearly every woman who shared his bed. A male heir. Henry's father had seized the crown on a battlefield, and the dynasty was barely 2 decades old. In Henry's mind, a daughter meant civil war. A son meant survival. That obsession hardened, year by year, into something monstrous, because Henry never blamed himself when sons failed to arrive. He blamed the woman. And when Henry blamed a woman, families fell, titles vanished, and sometimes heads rolled. Ranked by how brutally they suffered, his 6 queens tell the true story of his reign, better than any battle ever could. Some were destroyed slowly, over decades. Some were destroyed in a single morning. One walked away rich. But the first woman into the machine had no idea what she was marrying. Because in 1509, neither did Henry. Catherine of Aragon was born on December 16, 1485, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. Monarchs so powerful they'd bankrolled Columbus. She came to England at 15 to marry Henry's older brother Arthur, and was widowed within 5 months. Then, on June 11, 1509, she married Henry himself. She was 23, he was 17. And for nearly 2 decades it worked. Catherine was intelligent, devout, and genuinely loved by the English people. When Henry went off to war in France in 1513, she governed as regent while a Scottish invasion was crushed. But her real job, the only job that counted, was happening in the birthing chamber, and it was slowly breaking her. 6 documented pregnancies, stillbirths, infants dead within weeks, including a son who lived just 52 days. Of all those children, only one survived. A daughter, Mary, born in 1516. By the mid-1520s, Henry had decided God was punishing the marriage, and he wanted out. What followed wasn't a divorce. It was a siege. When Rome refused to annul the marriage, Henry tore England away from the Catholic Church entirely. This from a man who had once written a book defending the Pope so passionately that Rome named him. Defender of the faith, the Pope's star pupil burned down the school over a divorce. Catherine refused to surrender her title, so Henry took everything else. From 1531, she was banished from court and shuttled between increasingly bleak residences, ending at damp, remote Kimbolton Castle. Most devastating of all, she was cut off from her daughter. Mother and child kept apart for most of Catherine's final 5 years. Leverage designed to force a surrender that never came. On January 7th, 1536, Catherine died at Kimbolton, aged 50, still insisting she was the true queen. A farewell letter to Henry, a text that only surfaces in later collections and whose authenticity historians still debate, reportedly closed with the words, "Mine eyes desire you above all things." 8 hours after her death, a household candlemaker, not a doctor, opened her body and reported that her heart was quite black and hideous, unchanged after 3 washings. The imperial ambassador immediately suspected poison. Modern doctors suggest something sadder. The description matches a cancerous growth, possibly a melanotic sarcoma. Though with no physician present, that remains an educated guess. The disease that likely killed her naturally would fuel murder rumors for centuries. In the ranking of suffering, Catherine of Aragon takes 3rd place. 24 years of marriage repaid with 5 years of enforced isolation, a stolen child, and a lonely death. But at least her end came naturally. The woman who replaced her wouldn't be so lucky. Anne Boleyn was the reason for all of it. Or so the simple version goes. Born around 1501 or possibly 1507, she arrived at the English court polished by years in the French royal household. Witty, stylish, magnetic. Henry pursued her for roughly 7 years, and she held out for nothing less than the crown. They married in secret in January 1533. She was crowned that June, and in September she gave birth to a child who would one day become England's greatest monarch, Elizabeth. There was just one problem. Elizabeth was a girl. Anne's entire position rested on producing a son, and her body kept failing at the worst possible moments. A lost pregnancy in 1534. Then, in January 1536, the very month Catherine of Aragon died, Anne miscarried a male child of about 15 weeks. Hostile propaganda would later claim the fetus was deformed. No contemporary source records any such thing, and historians dismiss it as a smear invented by Catholic polemicists decades afterward. But the miscarriage itself was real, and it was a death sentence in slow motion. Henry had already noticed a quiet lady-in-waiting named Jane Seymour. His chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, the efficient destroyer, a man who could make almost anything legal, went to work. On May 2nd, 1536, Anne was arrested and rowed to the Tower. The charges: adultery with 5 men, including her own brother George, and plotting the king's death. Modern historians overwhelmingly regard the case as constructed. The only confession came from a musician, Mark Smeaton, reportedly extracted under torture, and no independent evidence of any affair has ever surfaced. In the Tower, Anne swung between terror and a horrifying gallows humor. The Tower's constable recorded her putting her hands around her own throat and saying, "I heard say the executioner was very good, and I have a little neck," and then laughing. On May 15, she was tried before 26 peers. The judge was her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, the ruthless uncle, who reportedly wept as he sentenced his niece to death. He cried. And then he condemned her anyway. In the Tudor court, tears were apparently just part of the paperwork. 2 days later, her marriage to Henry was declared null and void, which meant, by the court's own logic, she could never have committed adultery against a marriage that had never existed. Nobody paused to notice. On May 19, 1536, Anne was beheaded on Tower Green and buried in an old arrow chest in the chapel a few steps away. She had been queen for less than 3 full years. In the ranking of suffering, Anne Boleyn takes second place. Judicially murdered on fabricated charges at the will of her own husband. And the true story of that, Merciful, French sword was buried in the state archives, where it would stay hidden for nearly 500 years. Because 11 days after Anne's head fell, Henry married again. Jane Seymour was everything Anne wasn't. Quiet, pale, obedient, and steered toward the throne by an ambitious family who had watched exactly what happened to the last 2 queens and pushed their daughter into the machine anyway. Henry married her on May 30, 1536, 11 days after executing his previous wife. The schoolbook rhyme says Jane simply died. Peacefully, it's implied wrapped in triumph as the beloved wife. The medical record says otherwise. In 1537, Jane became pregnant, and Henry, giddy with hope, indulged her every craving. When she developed a fierce appetite for quail, he fired off letters to his ambassadors in Flanders, demanding birds be shipped across the sea. On October 9, 1537, Jane went into labor. It lasted roughly 30 hours. At 2 in the morning on October 12th, she delivered the son Henry had torn a country apart to get. Prince Edward. For 3 days, it looked like a completed fairy tale. Jane was even well enough to receive visitors after the christening on October 15. Then the fever came. Contemporary letters chart the decline with grim precision. Burning fever. Delirium. Her body failing piece by piece. The most likely cause, historians believe, was puerperal sepsis, childbed fever, an infection contracted during delivery, agonizing and in that century untreatable. Jane died shortly before midnight on October 24, 1537, 12 days after giving birth, aged about 28, queen for barely 17 months. Henry gave her the grandest funeral of any of his wives and later chose to be buried beside her. In death, she was rewritten as the perfect wife. Yet there's a bitter footnote. Plague in London had forced her coronation to be postponed, so Jane died without ever being crowned. The truest queen never wore the crown at all. In the ranking of suffering, Jane Seymour takes 4th place. She got the fairy tale, and it killed her in 12 days. The next bride would survive the marriage, by being rejected almost before it began. Wife number 4 was a foreign policy decision. Anne of Cleves, a German duke's daughter born in 1515, was selected largely from a portrait to seal a Protestant alliance. When she arrived in England, Henry, now approaching 50, with a festering leg ulcer and a waistline his own armourers tracked expanding from roughly 32 inches to 52, decided he wasn't attracted to her. The man whose tailors were letting out steel plate by the yard declared himself the disappointed party. He married her anyway on January 6, 1540, then complained privately that he could not consummate the marriage. Within 6 months he wanted out, and this time the exit was nearly bloodless. The marriage was annulled on July 9, 1540, on grounds of a prior betrothal contract and non-consummation. Anne, after brief resistance, made the smartest move any of the 6 wives ever made. She agreed. Her reward was staggering: £4,000 a year, Richmond Palace, Bletchingley. Later, Hever Castle itself, the childhood home of Anne Boleyn, and the official rank of the King's sister, outranking every woman in England except the Queen and the King's daughters. She stayed in England, developed a fondness for English ale and English fashion, hosted generously, and outlived Henry and every one of his other wives, dying wealthy and independent in 1557. In the ranking of suffering, Anne of Cleves takes 6th place. The least brutalized, though least still meant public rejection. A humiliating official inquiry into her marriage bed and permanent separation from her homeland. Being found unlovable by Henry VIII turned out to be the luckiest break a woman in Tudor England could get. The girl who came next would prove it with her life. Catherine Howard should never have been anywhere near a throne. She was the Duke of Norfolk's niece. The same ruthless uncle who had wept his way through sentencing Anne Boleyn. And while her exact birth year is unknown, she was almost certainly under 21 when she died, and possibly as young as 17. Henry married her on July 28, 1540, a teenager wed to an obese, ulcer-ridden man of 49. That same day, across London, Thomas Cromwell was beheaded. The efficient destroyer had arranged one royal marriage too many, and the machine he'd built devoured him too. Catherine had grown up, loosely supervised in her step-grandmother's crowded household, where as a young teenager she was drawn into sexual relationships with older men. A history that reads very differently to modern eyes than the promiscuous adulteress of the schoolbooks. In November 1541, that past reached Henry's ears, along with allegations that as queen she had held secret meetings with a courtier named Thomas Culpeper, meetings arranged by Lady Rochford, the doomed informant, the same woman whose testimony had helped destroy Anne and George Boleyn 5 years earlier. Whether anything beyond meetings and letters ever happened with Culpeper has never been proven. We'll likely never know the truth. It didn't matter. Parliament passed a law making it treason for an unchaste woman to marry the king. Legislation written, in effect, specifically to kill her. And on the evening of February 12, 1542, Catherine made a request that may be the most heartbreaking detail in the entire Tudor story. She asked for the executioner's block to be brought to her room, and spent her final night practicing how to place her head on it. A terrified teenager, rehearsing the etiquette of her own death so she wouldn't stumble in the morning. The next day she was beheaded with an axe on Tower Green, on the same spot as Anne Boleyn, and buried near her in the same chapel. Lady Rochford died minutes later. The famous last words, that she'd rather have died the wife of Culpeper, appear only in one unreliable Spanish chronicle. The English eyewitnesses recorded nothing of the kind. In the ranking of suffering, Catherine Howard takes first place. The youngest, the least prepared, the most disposable. A girl handed to an old man by her ambitious family, then legally slaughtered when her childhood was weaponized against her. The last wife was the cleverest. Catherine Parr, born around 1512, was already twice widowed when Henry's eye landed on her in 1543, and by then, marrying Henry VIII was less an honor than a diagnosis. Refusing wasn't a realistic option. They married on July 12, 1543. Catherine was a genuine intellectual. In 1545, she became the first woman in England to publish a book in English under her own name. And that brilliance nearly killed her. By 1546, her enthusiasm for religious reform had made powerful enemies, and they persuaded the aging, paranoid king that his own wife was a heretic. A warrant for her arrest was drawn up, and heresy could mean burning. According to the account preserved by the chronicler John Fox, the plot leaked. Someone warned Catherine, and she went to Henry and delivered the performance of her life. Her theological arguments, she claimed, had never been real opinions at all, merely a wifely trick to distract him from the pain of his ulcerated leg, and a chance to be instructed by his wisdom. The most educated, most published queen in English history saved her own neck by pretending to be a fool. When guards arrived the next day to arrest her, Henry drove them off himself. Catherine survived him. Henry died on January 28, 1547, and then came history's final cruelty. Months later, she married the man she'd loved before Henry interrupted, Thomas Seymour, and at about 36 became pregnant for the first time. She gave birth to a daughter on August 30th, 1548, and died 6 days later of postpartum infection, the same class of childbed fever that had killed Jane Seymour 11 years earlier. She escaped Henry, and then died anyway, taken by the era's oldest killer of queens and commoners alike. In the ranking of suffering, Catherine Parr takes 5th place. The survivor whose survival lasted 19 months. So the ledger closes like this. 6th, Anne of Cleves, rejected into a golden retirement. 5th, Catherine Parr, who outwitted a signed warrant only to be killed by childbirth. 4th, Jane Seymour, granted the fairy tale and dead 12 days later. Third, Catherine of Aragon, ground down through 5 slow years of isolation. Second, Anne Boleyn, judicially murdered on invented charges. First, Catherine Howard, a teenager rehearsing her own beheading alone in the dark. Henry outlived 5 of the 6 and was buried, at his own instruction, beside Jane Seymour, the wife who died giving him what he wanted. And that would be the end of the story, except for one document that sat unnoticed in the National Archives for centuries, waiting to answer the question left hanging over that May morning in 1536. Back on Tower Green, the sword and the mercy. For generations, the story went that Henry granted Anne Boleyn a French swordsman out of some last ember of love, a cleaner, kinder death than the axe. Then, in recent years, historian Tracy Borman drew attention to a rediscovered Tudor warrant book at the National Archives, containing Henry's own instructions for his wife's execution, drafted in the days before her death. The document is chilling precisely because it isn't emotional. It's administrative. It notes, first, that Anne had been condemned to die by burning alive or by beheading at the king's pleasure. Burning was the standard sentence for a woman convicted of treason. Then it records that the king, moved by pity, would spare her the fire. And then it issues the command. The head of the said Anne was to be cut off, with the constable of the Tower instructed to omit nothing from the orders. Henry didn't distance himself from Anne's death. He drafted it. He selected the method of his wife's killing the way another man might choose the wording of a contract. And one final detail destroys the mercy legend completely. The swordsman from Calais had been summoned days before Anne's trial even began. His fee of £23, 6 shillings and 8 pence later itemized in Cromwell's accounts, filed as neatly as a bill for candles. The executioner was booked before the verdict was pronounced. That is what mercy meant in Henry's England. A king so certain of a rigged outcome that he hired the blade first, then congratulated himself in writing for his pity. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. 6 women, 1 machine. And the man at the controls kept the receipts. Thanks for watching History's Hidden Lives. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us.